Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
It's the early 1790s. The Frenchmen have stormed the Bastille. The monarchy's been wiped away. And France is entangled in yet another war with England. And the young United States of America is in debt to both France and England. There are conflicting treaties and division within the American political system as well as the American population. And American diplomacy and fortitude will be pushed to the limit over the next several years. We've been working our way through our series on King Charles I of England. When we left off last week, Charles had fled London and John Pym was now in control of Parliament, the City of London, and the militia itself. And he was sitting pretty high. Charles was pretty low. We worked our way through the prelude to the coming English Civil War. But I wanted to take a break this week. I hope you don't mind. We'll get back to King Charles I next week. But earlier this week, I had another extended conversation with Travis Masterbone on the Unveiled Patriot. And we talked about the XYZ Affair and the decade of the 1790s in the early United States of America. And so because it's fresh in my mind and I've been doing a little bit of research on it the last few weeks, I wanted to take some time today and work through the XYZ Affair. But I also wanted to work through the backstory, the things that led up to the XYZ Affair, and then all of the fallout, because there was international fallout with both England and France. But we're going to focus on the national fallout internally inside of the United States. And so just as the 1640s were a disastrous decade for the English monarchy and the people of England, so too the 1790s were almost a complete disaster of the newly formed and organized United States of America. We could easily have lost it all. We didn't survive the decade by shrewdness and wisdom. We didn't survive through national unity. The fact that we survived probably had more to do with the troubles in Europe and the miraculous than any particular actions on the part of the federal government. There were a lot of well-known and celebrated men involved in this turmoil. These were not our greatest years, but they can teach us a lot. So it's the 1790s, and a young America is about to be stretched and tested on not just one, but two diplomatic fronts, with all the trimmings of a national emergency, including a very divided government and a very united, patriotic population, when it came to a sense of national pride, and a very disunified population when it came to international affairs. So there's a lot here today. Buckle your seatbelts. America faced a lot of challenges in the early years of independence, not the least of which was pressure from the European nations. England's commercial laws, Spain's closure of the mouth of the Mississippi River, which hurt trade in the Ohio Valley. And then there was the French Revolution. There were treaties to be recognized, like the Treaty of 1783 with Great Britain, which, among other things, obligated payment to creditors on both sides of the Atlantic. The problem was that America had bought a lot of things on credit, more than they could pay for. It's kind of like a bank. You know, they've got your money, but if everybody wants their money all at once, then they don't. Well, the Americans had money, but they certainly couldn't pay back all of their debts at once. English creditors wanted their money. And to make matters worse, much of the assets the Americans had, much of the hard assets, commodities and crops that could have been used for payments had been confiscated by the British. So there wasn't much to liquidate. Some of the people did liquidate all that they had, and then they just slipped into the countryside, never to be heard from again, and certainly never to pay those debts. Another issue with the English was the treatment of the Loyalists. According to the treaty, they were to be treated fairly. Amnesty granted, restoration of property, things like that. But there were some really hard feelings in the country. And the English Loyalists weren't treated very well oftentimes. So with the debts unpaid and the Loyalists ill-treated, as a couple of examples, the English refused to give up their forts along the western frontier, places like Oswego and Detroit and Erie, and they stirred up the natives to attack the sprawling American population. Basically, England controlled the Great Lakes region when it came to travel, trade, and commerce. And the young United States government was forced to respond to that native threat. So Arthur St. Clair was put in charge of a 2,300-man army, a poorly trained 2,300-man army, and he had been given some instructions by George Washington himself, who was at least a little familiar with the area. Well, even with Washington's instruction, the army was attacked at the Wabash River and it was wiped out. All but 600 men were lost, as well as the supplies which had been completely abandoned. The natives let the 600 go after a short chase, and then they returned to the wounded and tortured them. This was a national embarrassment, an embarrassment suffered by the Federalist government. Now, you want to keep that in mind. This is the Federalist government in charge. The Anti-Federalists had a field day with this. Washington was pissed. He's recorded as saying, quote, "It's all over. St. Clair is defeated, routed. Here in this very spot, I told him to beware of ambush. And he had to suffer that army to be cut to pieces, hacked and tomahawked by a surprise, the very thing I warned him against. Oh God, he's worse than a murderer. How can he answer to his countrymen?" End quote. He did add that General St. Clair would have full justice. Man, I wish our leaders had this kind of will for the advancement of the nation today, wanting us to win, wanting us to solve our problems, to take care of business. It doesn't matter what the particular issue is. It's only reasonable to assume or have that reasonable expectation that our leaders actually want to win. They want to succeed on our behalf. Washington did. And so he sent James Anthony Wayne, a seasoned veteran of native warfare, to the same region, and he moved deep into native territory. And in August of 1794, he came across 1,300 native warriors just 2 miles from an English fort. The natives hightailed it to the fort, but found it locked to them. As Wayne charged past the fort, there were some unpleasantries spoken by both sides. So there was this constant tension between the Americans and the English presence and the natives. And that constant tension would be interrupted when Europe exploded into yet another round of war. England had joined an alliance to intercede in the French Revolution. I mean, after all, this was an affront to monarchs everywhere. The French Republic was a repudiation of monarchianism, and that threatened to undermine the other European governments. Obviously, the idea of a republic was very odious to most European countries. Not so much the Dutch, but for everybody else. And the English Navy proved to be superior to the French Navy. And they put an embargo on French shipping. And they blocked the sugar-producing colonies of the French West Indies, Guadeloupe and Santo Domingo, and the merchants of Boston saw dollar signs. The problem was that England would not let anyone ship those French goods to Europe. They were molesting American vessels, confiscating them. They were arresting our sailors. They were stripping them naked and browbeating them. The American press was outraged. Rumors of war began to circulate. And oddly, it was the Boston merchants who were most nervous. I mean, they didn't want their trade disrupted. They wanted to be able to, bootleg the stuff from the West Indies, but they didn't want their regular trade and commerce disrupted. Even in the face of the occasional lost ship and cargo, not to mention men, the money was worth the risk. Besides, tensions might be high, but avoiding outright war would keep the British from closing our ports. George Washington, our president, was for peace as well. We could not have handled a war at that point. So the diplomatic channels were opened, and John Jay went to London. His optimism was quickly turned to concern. The English held all the cards, and they knew it. And they played for keeps, kind of. They agreed to abandon the Northwest forts as long as a new joint commission was formed to settle those old debts. But there was more. They also stipulated that no American ships over 70 tons could enter British West Indian ports, and no American vessels could transport molasses, sugar, coffee, cocoa, or cotton to Europe. Oh, and England had full access to all American ports and waterways, with the most favored nation status for trade. This was a very lopsided deal that they offered. The United States Senate only ratified the treaty after removing the business about the West Indies, but it was still lopsided. And at that point, Once it was ratified, the treaty was made public. And the public was angry. The public was very angry. They took it out on John Jay. He was a cursed man at that point. They burned him in effigy. On the brighter side, war with England had been avoided. That would have been completely disastrous. So it's all good, right? I mean, we've avoided being completely destroyed. Wrong. Before all this business had even started, back in April of 1793, a French ship arrived in Charleston. Edmond Charles Genet, the French ambassador, had arrived. He was extremely popular with the American public. He called himself Citizen Genet as a sign of solidarity with the American public. They had been subjects under the monarch, but in the new republic, they were citizens, and so was Edmond Charles Genet. A pretty slick and tactical move, if you don't mind me saying so. He knew how to pander to the crowd. In a way, he was singing to the choir because the USA was a very pro-France nation at this point in time. People flew French flags. So Citizen Genet was received with all of the fanfare one might expect from an adoring, grateful nation from Charleston all the way to Philadelphia, the nation's capital at that time. Anyway, he was very good at selling himself and France. But he was on a mission, a very serious mission in the name of the French Republic. It didn't take much selling. The Americans had a lot in common with France. Not only had France helped us during the Revolution, but they had overthrown their own monarch. They had created their own republic. And he was looking to cash in on the French Treaty of 1778. I mean, you see where this is going, right? The French treaty contradicted the English treaty of both 1783 and the one to come in 1794. But we'll get there. So the Treaty of 1778 gave France the ability to bring French prizes to America in times of war. America, according to the treaty, was not supposed to outfit privateers against France, and we were supposed to recognize French colonial territory in the Caribbean. You see the position that we're in. There was the Rock of England, then the U.S., and then the hard place of France. Not a comfortable place for us to be, to say the least. From the U.S. perspective, the Treaty of 1778 referenced a defensive war. Here's where they tried to worm their way out of it. France had started this war. So was this a loophole? I mean, did they have to actually support that Treaty of 1778 if France was the aggressor? No, the French didn't see that as a loophole. But there was a push for American neutrality. Even Thomas Jefferson, the pro-French guy, agreed, but also recommended caution on how we dealt with both nations. Let's tiptoe through the tulips. Well, meanwhile, Genet was busy rallying the U.S. sentiment to his aid. He was very industrious. He encouraged the Kentuckians to attack the Spanish in New Orleans. George Rogers Clark was among those Kentuckians. He was outfitting the French West Indies. He was provoking a Canadian rebellion. He was using American seamen as privateers against the English. And he had the support of the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican Party. Washington was not happy. Genet knew it. He recalled once in Philadelphia, quote, "Old Washington cannot pardon my success and enthusiasm with which the entire city rushed to meet me. He embarrasses my movements in 1,000 ways," end quote. You see, Washington saw the big picture. These actions could get the U.S. in trouble with England. He told Genet that he could not stop the preparations being made, meaning Washington, I can't stop you. But he also told Genet that he needed to make those preparations and then leave quickly. Oh, and one more thing. Washington told him U.S. ports were off limits to use as a base. Genet seems to have overreached at this point. He overplayed his hand. He misunderstood his place. Because of the French popularity in America, he tried to circumvent George Washington with Congress and the public. The pro-French press was rallying against Washington. They charged him with wanting to be king. His response was that he regretted not resigning previously. He'd rather have been on his farm at this point. He was mad. Even though Jefferson's Republican Party, and by the way, it's Jeffersonians, it's the Democratic Republican Party, the Republican Party. I'll probably use those phrases interchangeably. I'm sorry if that confuses you. You've got the Federalists on one side with guys like George Washington and John Adams. And then you've got the other guys, the Jeffersonians, the Republicans, the Democrat Republicans. Anyways, I'll use those interchangeably. He did come to realize that this could backfire and hurt the party. Genet was playing a high-stakes game, and if the population really understood what was going on, they may turn on him. They may turn on Jefferson. In July of 1793, Jefferson learned that there was a ship, the Little Sarah, that had been brought into port by a French man-of-war that was being equipped for battle. He made Genet promise him it would not sail without him knowing. And then a few days later, Genet let it slip out to sea. Well, Washington freaked. He called Genet's bluff, and he asked, is the minister of the French Republic to set the acts of this government at defiance and then threaten the executive with an appeal to the people? Governor Morris, the U.S. ambassador to France, requested Genet's recall. Actually, the U.S. didn't force Genet to leave the country because they knew if he did and he went back to France, he probably would have been executed. So he wasn't recalled, but he wasn't the ambassador either. And he lived out his days in the U.S., eventually dying in the 1830s. So he was here quite a while. Anyway, so there's real tension brewing here with the French about the time things were heating up with the English. Then there was the division within our federal government. The Federalists preferred England. The Republicans preferred France. So fast forward, it's the election of 1796, Adams versus Jefferson. At this point, these guys basically hate each other. The election was dirty. At some point, I want to do a series about all of the conflicts that took place between our founding fathers. And one of the greatest conflicts is between Adams and Jefferson. Frankly, some of the greatest conflicts are with Jefferson versus like everybody. But at any rate, Adams and Jefferson had a very dirty election in 1796. I mean, Jefferson once said of Adams, quote, Mr. Adams and his Federalists wish to sap the Republic by fraud, destroy it by force, and elect an English monarch in its place, end quote. So anyways, Adams' term ran from March 4th, 1797 through March 4th, 1801. And most of the rest of our story today takes place during these years. So we've now set the stage. The English had been pacified by the Jay Treaty. The French were getting all ginned up. They were looking for a Jeffersonian government that may be more sympathetic to their cause. And they meddled in our election that year. One French minister, Pierre Auguste Adet, or Adet, A-D-E-T, used both carrot and stick with the American public. In the Aurora, a publication, he encouraged us. He said basically the success of America was an encouragement to the French. But he also threatened war if Thomas Jefferson was not elected president. And guess what? That threat threw votes to Adams, and it infuriated the nation. And John Adams won the presidency. And meanwhile, James Monroe, a Jeffersonian Republican and supporter of the French Revolution, was dispatched to France as the American ambassador. And he was received well. I mean, they liked James Monroe. All was good until it wasn't. They learned about John Jay's trip to London, and they pressed Monroe for information, and he was stymied. He didn't know about the trip. Then a copy of the treaty arrived in Paris in 1795. They demanded to know if the Americans were going to ignore the Treaty of 1778. Now think about this if you're James Monroe. There's obviously been some tension with France the last few years. And it's not like in contemporary times where you can pick up a phone or you can send an email. He's in Paris on his own here, isolated, and he doesn't know about the Jay Treaty. So this wasn't a good situation. As a matter of fact, the French, they had a fit. They cut off diplomatic ties and Monroe came home. The French began confiscating American ships. They began arresting and imprisoning American seamen. In 1796, Charles Cotsworth Pinckney, or we'll call him Cece, arrived in Paris as Monroe's replacement, and he was not received well. He was threatened with imprisonment or expulsion. So we had appeased England and lost France. The country wanted war with France, but Adams forged a better path with a great deal of patience and determination, not to mention quite a few mistakes, frankly. Now, President Adams knew the situation had to be fixed. So in October of 1797, he sent a three-man delegation to France to meet with Monsieur Talleyrand of the French Foreign Office. The three men were John Marshall, Elbridge Gerry, and C.C. Pinckney. And Talleyrand kept them waiting. And then he appeared and rather rudely told them that he would not meet with them at that point in time, but he would meet later. And it was a few days later when Pinckney was approached by Nicholas Hubbard and told that the U.S. was to make a generous loan to France and pay a bribe to Talleyrand. Well, obviously, Pinckney was furious, but he kept his cool and he said he needed to speak to the other diplomats. At a dinner in John Marshall's room a few days later, Monsieur Bellamy brought it up again. He even had a plan for how to do it without anybody knowing, to keep this secret, to save the embarrassment, of the Americans. According to Bellamy, the U.S. could purchase some Dutch securities owned by the French government at that point at twice their value, like $10 million worth, plus another few $100,000 for Talleyrand himself. The American delegation refused. The dinner didn't end well. Frankly, the dinner ended there. Bellamy made his exit breathing threats against the Americans. But Talleyrand was persistent. And next, he sent a Monsieur Hottinguer, Hottinguer, who told the Americans he needed a clearer answer. I think that's just a little intimidating, isn't it? You're in a foreign country. You already know that diplomatic relations are not good. They're superior to your country. You've got very little support. And they're asking you for a bribe. And when you've told them no flatly, to the point that clearly Bellamy understood, he's threatening you as he leaves, right? Then they send a guy a couple days later, and he says, we just need to know, we weren't really clear on exactly where you stood with that. We need you to clarify your position. But they stood their ground, and again, they said no, with Pinckney shouting, not a sixpence. And so, yet again, Talleyrand tried one more time. He sent Monsieur Hotval, and he sensed that Gerry was starting to crack, so he highly recommended Marshall and Pinckney leave the country and equally recommended that Gerry remain. Again, that's got to be extraordinarily intimidating. As a matter of fact, Marshall and Pinckney invited Gerry to come back, but he stayed. When news of the failed venture hit America, Adams had no choice but to admit defeat. And the national motto was millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. Adams thought the nation should prepare for war. But of course, just like in our day, the opposition party, the Jeffersonians, said that he was basically making more of the whole situation than he should have, that he was blowing it out of proportion. He was exaggerating what had happened to provoke a war with France. There were still a lot of folks who preferred France over England. There had been some issues, but a lot of folks didn't like England. There were both French and Irish immigrants. Both groups were anti-English. So not exactly fans of the Federalist Party either. There's a lot of division and a lot of infighting in those days. The Republicans demanded that Adams release the documents. Adams claimed executive privilege in the name of national security, but eventually he was worn down. He was persuaded to release the documents to prove that he was telling the truth and get the country to prepare for whatever lie ahead. But in an effort to protect the men who would extort America, the personal men, it was okay to say that, France had tried to extort us, but Adams was attempting to protect the men that actually had done the extorting. So he released the transcripts, but he removed the names of the messengers, and he replaced their names with letters. Bellamy was X, and Hottinguer was Y, and Hotval was Z. Actually, the first guy, Nicholas Hubbard, he originally had been W in Adams's account. For whatever reason, we remember this as the XYZ Affair and not the WXYZ Affair. So, at any rate, the American public, once they digested this information, was understandably outraged. Again, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. This situation was as serious as a heart attack. Think how vulnerable the young United States was at this point. They could not have sustained a war with England or France. But at any rate, we prepared the best we could. I mean, the army was formed. They swelled the ranks. George Washington himself was called out of retirement. The Navy was sent to sea. The coastal areas were fortified, kind of like England, I picture it, during the time of the Spanish Armada. They fortified the seaports and the coastlines to fend off a potential invasion. Ships were being built at all the major ports: Boston, Charleston, Portland, Salem. New York City raised $30,000 in 1 hour to support the war effort. It was during these years that we helped the Haitians with their own revolt for independence against the French. So, needless to say, the love affair with all things French was over. And French sympathizers kept pretty quiet at this point. On the open seas, hostilities began. This was what's known as the Quasi War. It was an undeclared war that was fought from July of 1798 through September 1800 between America and France, primarily off the coast of America and in the Caribbean. During this time, American vessels took 84 French vessels. The national outrage and the unofficial war at sea were not the only actions taken by the U.S. There was congressional action as well, hotly contested and very divisive action. The Federalist-controlled Congress took steps to ensure the security of the United States by enacting a series of 4 laws known collectively as the Alien and Sedition Acts in June and July of 1798. Simply put, the first 3 were focused on the French and Irish immigrants primarily. The first one was the Naturalization Act, which increased residency requirements for citizenship from 5 years to 14. They come over here as French and Irish immigrants, and they become citizens really pretty quickly, and they are immediately Jeffersonian Democrat Republicans. So they were blocked from citizenship. And secondly, the Alien Enemies Act, which empowered the government, the executive branch, it empowered the president to arrest and deport all male citizens of an enemy nation. And then thirdly was the Alien Friends Act. So you had the Alien Enemies Act, and now you've got the Alien Friends Act, which empowered the government, the executive branch, President John Adams, to deport any non-citizen suspected of plotting against the government, even in peacetime. Did you catch that? All he's got to do is take a dislike to a non-citizen, and he can send them on their way. So as we talked about before, the government and country was bitterly divided on just where our loyalties lie. But the Federalists, the pro-English guys, were in power, and the French had been pretty obnoxious as of late. So the Jeffersonians, the Republicans, or Democrat Republicans, whatever you choose, were unable to stop these laws from being passed. So not a lot of bipartisanship here. There was a lot of nasty words going back and forth. And to underscore their position, the Federalists accused the Republicans of being in cahoots with the French government. Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Gazette of the United States that the Jeffersonians were more Frenchmen than Americans and prepared to immolate the independence and welfare of their country at the shrine of France. You can see right through the various acts, or at least that was the Republican charge. These acts were partisan. Again, most of the immigrants coming into the country were pro-Jefferson. Making them cool down for an additional 9 years might temper their influence. Being able to expel them in a time of war could protect the country. And in a case like that of Citizen Genet, even in times of peace, some guys might have to go. And the problem is, who makes that decision? In the case of these acts, it was the president. It's pretty empowering. Maybe you just don't like a guy's political persuasion. Does that mean you can toss him out of the country? Yeah. The fourth act was the Sedition Act. This took aim at political dissent. And frankly, it took aim at their contemporary political dissent, meaning those who criticized President Adams or the Federalist government. The law outlawed, quote, scandalous and malicious writing against Congress or the president, and made it illegal to conspire to oppose any measure or measures of the government, end quote. There goes free speech. There goes freedom of the press. And again, who makes the call of what is scandalous or malicious? What is it to conspire against any measure or measures of the government? Is it when you just disagree? Is it if you're a voting member of Congress? Do you have to be an immigrant? I mean, how do you define these words? You see the debates that would have been raging. You see the fear that could spread over like 50% of the country. There was also backlash. James Madison, with help from Thomas Jefferson, wrote the Virginia Resolution. Jefferson penned the Kentucky Resolution himself. And in those resolutions, they argued the federal government did not have the authority to pass those laws. Jefferson argued, quote, the several states who formed the instrument, the Constitution, being sovereign and independent, have the unquestionable right to judge of its infraction, and that a nullification by those states of all unauthorized acts is the rightful remedy, end quote. You can hear this kind of a debate in our contemporary politics, can't you? The same types of things. States' rights versus federal rights. If the nation is in crisis, who has the authority? If the nation is in crisis, what can you say or not say? What is the role of the federal government? What kind of powers can they enact to protect the dignity of the country itself while trampling sometimes on the independent liberties? I mean, is that a debate that you're familiar with in contemporary culture? Certainly rings true, doesn't it? So often we can look back to generations gone by with these crystal spectacles like this illusion of perfection and of tranquility and peaceful coexistence. But as you dig a little deeper, you realize that that's just not always the case. And there were casualties of these acts as well. No less than 26 people were prosecuted under the Sedition Act. Most of them were editors of Republican newspapers, and every single one of them were opposed to the Adams administration. So it was biased and political. Matthew Lyon, a Republican congressman from Vermont, was the first person tried and then convicted in October of 1798. A grand jury indicted him for letters that he published in a Republican newspaper during his re-election campaign, which they said showed an intent to smear President Adams and the government. So the guy's running for re-election. He prints an ad in the local newspaper, and he's running for re-election, so he's got to be running on a platform. I'll be honest, I didn't look up what he wrote. I don't think it really matters, though. Look at how they talk to each other today. Anyways, they said that his newspaper ad had an intent to smear President Adams and the government. His defense was that the Sedition Act was unconstitutional. I mean, I don't know, we're about a decade removed from the, inauguration of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And finding him guilty here took away his freedom of speech and freedom of the press. At any rate, he lost, and he paid a $1,000 fine, which was a lot of money back then, and he spent 4 months in prison. If there's a silver lining to all of this, he won re-election while serving his time. Another guy, a guy named James Callender, spent 9 months in jail for, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writing against said president of the United States, end quote. Oddly enough, Callender wrote articles from jail supporting Jefferson's campaign. I mean, people are fickle, right? So when Jefferson won, Callender expected a government post for all of his efforts, but he was refused a post. And so James Callender, who did not like President Adams and who had supported Jefferson even from jail, again, people are fickle, when he failed to secure his post, he also broke the public story of Jefferson's longtime relationship with the slave Sally Hemings. Nice guy, huh? This guy's all over the boards. It's kind of humorous to watch. And again, we can kind of see some of these games playing out in contemporary politics today. Strange and desperate times call for strange and desperate measures. Anyway, the Alien and Sedition Acts helped Jefferson win in that nasty election of 1800. The acts had expired or been repealed by the end of Adams's presidency, except the Alien Enemies Act, which still exists. Actually, it was amended in 1918 to include women. And knowing that, especially with the amendment, Japanese internment comes to mind. Well, Japanese and German and Italian a little later in the 20th century. So as if all of this wasn't enough, there's more. And it's a little bit like Charles I, in my opinion, because John Adams seems to have made some very bad decisions. He pushed some very bad policies. And just like Charles I, we're beginning to see this kind of spiral out of control. I mean, Charles went from one bad decision to the next. He had, one bad situation to another. So at any rate, With the tension and very real threat of war, the country was in dire need of revenue to pay for the war. So the Adams Federalist-controlled Congress passed a federal property tax on all land, buildings, and slaves. Now think about this. We're not that far removed from the Revolution, which was supposedly fought over what? Taxation, unfair taxation, unrepresented taxation. The Federalists owned Congress. They drove this through. Everyone who had something in this country, everyone who had anything was going to contribute directly. So again, another overreach by Adams that made people really angry. There were folks who had tried to evade the taxes and they were caught, and then they would be imprisoned. So there was an episode in Pennsylvania, in the Bucks, Northampton, Montgomery counties area in Pennsylvania, to be precise, where a guy named John Fries led a group of men who, through intimidation, secured the release of a group of these prisoners. They were being held under the authority of the federal marshal. Well, President Adams called out federal troops and the militia, and they targeted the rowdies of these counties, and they arrested them, including John Fries. Fries was tried twice and convicted twice of treason, and his hanging was avoided only by the pardon of President Adams in April 1880. As a matter of fact, everybody involved received a presidential pardon. Adams must have recognized just how bad the optics were here. But if you look at the state of the nation at this point, fun times, right? I mean, look at the division that's going on. But anyways, as if Don Pardo from, those 70s and 80s game shows on TV was here, there's more. When the realization sank in of the XYZ affair, before a second delegation had been sent to France, Dr. George Logan, a prominent Republican Quaker from Pennsylvania, where else? Pennsylvania, the same state where Fry's Rebellion took place, the same state that hosted the Whiskey Rebellion, now had one of its own take the bull by the horns. So George Logan sailed to France to try to negotiate with the French government. Now remember, he's a pro-French guy. So anyway, some of his ideas were adopted by the French. And in a way, he did help to bring the hostilities to an end between the two countries. Of course, there was enough tension amongst Americans as it was, so when he returned, the Republicans hailed him as a hero. The Federalists thought he was a scoundrel. So the following year, in 1799, just a year removed from the unpopular Alien and Sedition Acts, the federal tax that upset the common folks, the Adams administration, and again, the Federalist Congress, passed a bill into law called the Logan Act, which was designed to prevent private citizens from entering into negotiations with foreign governments without official authorization. I mean, in all honesty, that does seem to make sense to me. But the Logan Act states this. It's very short and sweet, but there's a lot if we were to unpack this. We could spend episodes just unpacking these phrases and statements. So it says, quote, any citizen of the United States, wherever he may be, who, without authority of the United States, directly or indirectly commences or carries on any correspondence or intercourse with any foreign government or any officer or agent thereof in relation to any disputes or controversies with the United States or to defeat the measures of the United States shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 3 years or both. This section shall not abridge the right of a citizen to apply himself or his agent to any foreign government or the agents thereof for redress of any injury which he may have sustained from such government or any of its agents or subjects. End quote. Translation, don't meddle in the affairs of government uninvited. Now, this has been a controversial law since its inception, and it's one that's hard to prosecute. Two contemporary guys with very recognizable names that have faced scrutiny by the Logan Act are Jesse Jackson in the 1980s and Michael Flynn just a few years ago. The Logan Act has an interesting history, but it's definitely a subject for another day. If you read the history of it, and if you think about the language, it is extraordinarily difficult to prosecute somebody under the Logan Act. It's more like a warning sign. So I mentioned before a second official delegation to France. With all these things taking place, the various laws being pushed through Congress, the outrage of the general population, the undeclared war taking place on the seas, there was a real push for official war, declared war. But President Adams was very reluctant to officially declare war. That could have been catastrophic. So it must have been a relief when Talleyrand requested another delegation, promising a better reception and outcome. He claimed that he'd been bluffing. So in 1799, amid all the chaos, John Adams went with his gut and made a shrewd, calculated decision. He took a risk that paid off. In spite of all the missteps, he got this one right. When it counted, Adams came through. He sent another diplomatic envoy to meet with Talleyrand. There was Patrick Henry, there was William Vans Murray, minister to the Netherlands, and Oliver Ellsworth, the third Chief Justice of the United States. And these men got the job done. The Convention of 1800, or the Treaty of Mortefontaine, secured U.S. neutrality and released us from the previous obligations going back to the Revolution. France acquired a most favored nation status as a trading partner with the U.S. Well, all's well that ends well, right? Except this incident, or series of incidents, all interrelated from the troubles with the English forts and the John Jay Treaty through Citizen Genet and the botched diplomatic mission that ended with an undeclared war and attacks on our Constitution from within the ruling party. All of these things helped to propel Thomas Jefferson to victory over John Adams in the election of 1800. So as we wind this episode down, let me ask you, what is the role of government, especially in times of crisis? What happens to the rights of the people? I mean, when chaos seems to reign and war looms, and there's almost unprecedented division politically and socially, at least from a generational perspective, what powers does the government require? Are they empowered to make unilateral decisions based on which party's in power, against the desires of the people? Are they entitled to muzzle the media or target specific people or groups? And I'm not talking about checking our collective brains at the door. I mean, if trouble's coming from a specific area or a segment of the world or society, then you have to take action against that threat specifically. Pretending you can't identify the source of a problem when it's obvious, and sometimes it is obvious, is not just counterproductive to solving a societal risk. In the end, it's stupid and detrimental to the general population. I mean, this is not meant to be an open-ended series of questions. I'm talking about within the lawful boundaries of our current constitutional republic. I mean, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, right? Roosevelt had his internment camps, right? What is the role of government? Do you believe the need for the government to observe the law is heightened or relieved in uncertain times? Before you answer that with some sense of, purist motivation or self-righteous philosophical principles, remember, your position should be one that you'd extend to your rival. I think there are always hot-button issues that could sway most of us either way, depending on just what that issue is. In those times, I would hope the collective majority would blunt the damage that could be done based on a minority opinion, emotional as it might be, and the perceived threat and irrational reaction it might draw. One thing I find interesting about the XYZ affair is that there seemed to be more than just a general agreement that bribery on this level, with the stakes so high, was just plain wrong. Sometimes I'm not so sure our leaders today have that level of integrity. How about you? Do you think the average politician back then had more integrity than the average politician today? Or is that just being naive? I mean, those guys were pretty nasty to each other. And politics was, in many ways, every bit as much a blood sport in their day as ours. But I do feel like they had a desire to move the country forward. It does not always feel that way today. And I could be wrong. I could be too close to the contemporary landscape to be impartial. What do you think? Do you feel the current generation of political leaders in America are actually trying to solve problems? Is that even their job? Or is it to make sure the laws are followed? Is it to make sure the national borders are observed? Is it to enact legislation that enhances the model that we have? Or is the government's role to recreate America in the current ruling class's image? I don't know that I can answer those questions for somebody else. I believe responsible citizenship requires each of us to consider these questions, though. They cannot really be answered if we're not willing to put our opinions to the test against the lessons of history. So, at any rate, I titled this episode The XYZ Affair, Lessons in Diplomacy and Decorum for a Young Nation. I tried to make the XYZ affair itself the centerpiece of our consideration, but I thought it was needful to develop the backdrop and the fallout. All the various internal politics, hostility, and division that occurred during those years. I mean, we've covered a lot today. This could easily have been a 4 to 6 week study, especially when you know just how hard I can strain at a gnat. I mean, just the Alien and Sedition Acts, the Logan Act, Fry's Rebellion, all could be an episode or two. I hope I did them justice in this short overview. Do your own homework. Follow the history of the Alien and Sedition Acts or the Logan Act. It's a rich study. I mean, frankly, maybe we should spend some time on this. If you've listened to this episode and you want to hear more on the Alien and Sedition Acts or the Logan Act, you want me to break that down even more, send me a quick note, let me know. Because maybe we'll dive into that a little bit at some point. Anyways, it's interesting to me that the country was very divided and the Constitution was abused, in my opinion. But there was still a sense of nationalism and patriotism. Like the people were pissed at each other and pissed at political parties and pissed at politicians. But they really were rallying around the idea of the United States of America. And they all had a sense of national pride about them. In spite of their differences, nobody wanted the French or the English to bully or manipulate the United States of America. When I think about events like the XYZ affair and I learn about the related issues of that day, it really helps me to be careful about my opinions today. It encourages me to learn more about the context of not only the past, but the present issues as well. And I hope you feel the same way. We'll be spending a couple of more weeks on Charles I when we resume next week, before coming back to colonial America. But those stories are for another time. And until then, I hope our time together this time has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.